Good afternoon and welcome to our podcast, Pleasure for Health. This is Ailsa Kepi, your host, and today I thought we would jump into a topic that has come up since I was leading a retreat on the weekend, and there's been some interest in understanding a little bit more or exploring a little bit more about how we relate to other people that are close to us, and in particular in the way that we take feedback or we take the mirror of other people to learn about ourselves. Because what I found came up in this particular retreat was that some people are very strong in their sense of I, their sense of who they are, and they can put that out quite well, and people can have responses to them, and that all works quite well. But there's other people who don't necessarily have a very strong sense of their who they are, their I. And so those people, when they come into a group, tend to kind of lose themselves in the group. So I don't know if that resonates with you out there, but a lot of people do find that being in a group really brings up some different dynamics, and we learn that, oh, I'm actually not that strong in myself. I don't really know who I am, and I am much more responsive or even reactive to people around me. So this becomes actually quite difficult when we get into intimate relationships, or friendships or work relationships, because relationships kind of rely on us showing up as a person, right? Showing up with our own thoughts, our own feelings. And yet, we want to also be able to hear and listen to other people's thoughts and feelings, and not to override everyone in the group or the relationship with our own way of being. And, I find that typically we usually say, well, you can either be right or you can be married, right? So you have to kind of give up your being right in order to get along with someone. And that's kind of funny, but and potentially true up to a point. But it would be nice to think about, could it be possible to be in a relationship with someone, to know what I think and what I feel, but to also be open to what the other person is bringing forth, as regards to their response to me, and maybe I need to learn something from them. So if somebody gives me feedback and says, well, for me, you could have said this a different way, and I would have been able to take that in more easily. That's kind of a common feedback, right? We don't like the way our partner or someone says something to us, and we're like, well, if you had just said it this other way, I could really take that in. And that's something that is interesting to ponder. Is that asking them to do things our way, or is that asking for what we need, and is that a relevant thing? And it's kind of hard to tell who's on the who's whose perspective is going to be stronger. And most relationships end up being this kind of power struggle between our way of doing things and their way of doing things. And so it just kind of goes back and forth. And you know it feels like there should be something other than a power struggle that is possible. It feels like there should be an ability to learn about ourselves from being in relationship. That's another thing I noticed actually recently, just getting into this topic, from COVID, from a lot of people being isolated or potentially living on their own more these days, is that we don't have this mirror in our face that often. We tend to just be able to do what we want, what we think, how we want to do things, most of the time, at least in our culture here in the West. And we don't often have to take anyone else's advice. We don't often have to switch up our own way of doing things, or even look at ourselves like, am I actually doing things in the best way, even for myself? And it was interesting because I did have the experience of living in Morocco. And in that culture, I lived there for 7 years. So I married into the culture. So, I had quite a good perspective on that. It was interesting because in that culture, there was much more of a sense of collective. There was a collective way of doing things, and the individual is not so important. And so your individuality was not so recognized. It wasn't celebrated as much. It was more about, can you fit in with the group? Can you do things this way? And so I don't even think that in a lot of ways there wasn't even much learning about self in that kind of culture, because it was mostly about fitting in with the norm, doing you said decorating your house in a certain way, dressing in a certain way, when you go out, what you ate, what you cooked, when you had celebrations. Like, it was more about fitting into the collective. And there were lots of really good things about that kind of culture, one of which was my children were young at the time and really enjoyed having that collective care, right? They felt really safe in that space because everyone understood the same kinds of things. This was when you go out, this is where you play, this is what you eat, this is how things are done. And I must say that for young children, that felt really good for them, and they've shared that with me. They're now in their 20s and they live in Canada, but they grew up, under 10 years of age in Morocco, and I think they found a lot of benefit with having that kind of holding in a group container. However, in our culture here in the West, particularly Canada, the States, that kind of the Western countries, we do tend to celebrate the individual a lot more. And so we can become kind of egotistically narcissistic about our own way of doing things and the fact that we are right and our thoughts and our feelings, and we want to put that out. And especially like nowadays on social media, it's so common that we just put our thoughts and feelings right out there, and we don't really care what anyone else thinks about that, or whether we step on anyone else's feelings or space when we do that. And so if we get that reflection, so maybe somebody reflects to us like, hey, well, maybe there's this other way of looking at things, or maybe you forgot about this, or maybe there's another perspective that you haven't taken into account in your own way of doing things. When we hear that kind of feedback, it's actually quite hard to take in our culture. We kind of we fight that. We want to say, no, I want to be authentic, and this is my thought, and this is my feeling, and everyone should listen to me in that sense. So is that a good way of being? Well, it could be if we can keep an eye on the fact that we want to actually allow ourselves to hear feedback and to have that mirror of relationship, so that we're not just in an echo chamber with nobody else there with us, and we just keep putting out our own thoughts and feelings with a total disregard to anyone else or how it affects the rest of the world, if you will, or even just the other person. So this came up for me quite strongly in the retreat. There was someone quite close to me in the retreat, and for her, my way of dealing with a particular thing, I was the facilitator, felt like I was shutting her down. And that's an interesting kind of thing to happen, because in the group collective, I felt that this needed to be said in a different way, and that I couldn't just let her have her voice out there in the group, because I felt it was trampling on some other people's stuff. And as a facilitator, I don't know if any of you have been facilitators, but as a facilitator, it is partly your job to make sure that other people in the group don't feel trampled on by one or two people in the group. But there's always that kind of back and forth, and you have to let people have a say. But then there's also this kind of, well, let's kind of take this down a notch, maybe save it for later. Let's maybe talk about that in the break, or maybe we'll bring that to the next session, or that's a really interesting perspective. Let's just focus on this one for right now. It's tricky. And so if this one person wants to bring forward their view, and you you want to hear them, you want to validate their perspective, but it's not fitting in with the rest of the group, let's say, for instance, or it's bringing forward something that is also going to shut down someone else. This is when we get in this really interesting place of mirroring for each other. Well, when do we need to tone it down? When do we need to be quiet? When do we need to speak up? When do we need to have our say and be really strong with our viewpoint? And when is it just a matter of being heard, and maybe we could find another place to be heard where it would be more appropriate or more helpful for everybody involved? And that's a really tricky thing to decide and really feel into, intuit even, where is the right place to be more an individual and really have a sense of ourself, and where do we hear other people, and where do we notice the group. So I'm not sure if I have a foolproof plan or any kind of answer for this, but I wanted to really focus on this because I think it comes up for a lot of couples, in the sense that often one person will have a slightly different take on things than the other. And if one person's sense of self is dependent on agreement and validation of their viewpoint, then often the other person in the relationship will feel that they need to spend most of their time validating and supporting their partner, rather than being able to also have their own valid take on things and their perspective. And so it's a relationship skill that we often don't work on that much, because I think we do have such a culture of have your voice, have your say, put your own words out there, especially on social media, where you're not face to face with someone. You're not actually looking in the mirror. You're kind of putting something in front of the mirror and letting it sit there when you're not even there, so you don't see the response. And if you were to say something out loud that was your perspective or your viewpoint, and you were right in front of someone, you would see if they were, looking aghast, or if they were happy about it, or if they agreed with you, or maybe they wanted to say their viewpoint or whatever. When we're really in front of people, that is more likely to happen than when we put things out on a platform where we're not getting real-time feedback. And so we have become less and less good at taking feedback at all. And, I find that this is an interesting skill to practice when we are working on relationships, because relationships, if you want to be intimate with someone, happen in real time. And they aren't just like social. You can't just say, well, this is my thought. Dun, da, da, da. You have to actually listen to, you have to kind of say, well, are you interested in hearing my thought on that? And here's what I think. And you have to know that your thought is totally valid, and be able to build and hold that integrity, that sense of self, that sense of who am I, while also listening to your partner. And perhaps they have their own perspective, and that doesn't have to invalidate yours. And so, I think this is something really worth working on. I'm interested to know if any of you out there have bumped up against this. If you're in the dating world, do you find that, you go on a date and everyone's polite for the first half an hour, or maybe even the first date, but after that people, they're kind of like, well, this is what I think. And then they have no room to hear how that might come across to you, and how they might want to take what you reflect back to them and tweak themselves a little bit without losing their sense of who they are, but, rub the corners off a little bit. We've kind of heard of that idea of softening our edges and rubbing the corners off. Actually, I had somebody who's been married for, a while, like decades, say to me that, they've rubbed the corners off each other. It doesn't mean they get on all the time. It doesn't mean they agree all the time, but they've kind of rubbed off those corners a little bit, and they can now have this relationship with each other. So I think maybe that needs to be stated a little more upfront for people getting into relationships, like, hey, this is going to rub some corners off you. Being with someone and really being intimate with someone, sharing a lot of time together is going to mean that you might have to soften around your edges a little bit, and that you may not be able to stay quite as clear as you might be when you're, on your own or just doing things by yourself. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. And so this is the nuance of it. It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries or that you can't say no to certain things, or you can say, here's my, non negotiable kind of self. But within this gray zone here, I'm willing to negotiate, or I'm willing to at least hear how that comes across to you. And even though I might keep my own opinion on that, I'm willing to understand that that might not be your opinion, that I could listen to your opinion, and that we could kind of go forth together, even if we're not always in agreement about everything. That's a super risky thing, right? It's very vulnerable to actually put yourself out there and be with someone that isn't exactly a carbon copy of you, is going to mirror back something about yourself that you might not be so happy to shift. So I think this relationship kind of idea of becoming more ourselves, but more willing to hear what other people might have to say, and where we might be willing to rub off a few corners in our own way of being without losing our own self. This is something I think is worth working on, and I think that it's something that I find with clients, that's often a topic we will discuss without really being overt about it. It's kind of like, oh, okay, this is what you'd like, and we go totally into what they would like. And here's where this might change as you bump up against your partner's likes and dislikes. And it could end up being a Venn diagram, where you have the two circles and they cross over for a small part. Maybe there's certain parts that cross over and you can totally be in agreement about these things, but there's lots of other things in the rest of the circle that doesn't cross over. And, this is important to recognize and really get clear about, instead of expecting our partner to change to the way we want them to be, or even expecting ourselves to change to be the way our partner wants us to be. So hopefully this has been an interesting kind of discussion and curiosity building platform, because what I would really like to invite you all to is to really notice, in your life, notice when there's things that you feel are really important to who you are as a being. And when there are things that, you could soften a little bit, maybe you could hear how that's coming across to other people a little bit. And without losing your identity, you could rub off some of your edges and see if that helps in the relationship arena for you. And again, the invitation is always there to reach out to me. You can check out my website, pleasureforhealth.com, and, find many other blogs and podcasts on interesting topics like this around relationship. And also reach out to me if you're interested in working with me. I do work with, all aspects of relationship, be it physical, mental, psychological, emotional, societal. I'm very interested to help people to find a way to both relate to themselves better and to their partners and to their family and friends and the world. So if you're interested, please do reach out, check out my website, and I hope to be with you again all soon.